$2,000 a month. For a dividend investor approaching retirement, that number can feel like a finish line. It means $24,000 arriving every year without selling a single share. The portfolio remains invested, the businesses continue operating, and the investor, at least in theory, begins living from the cash those businesses distribute. It sounds remarkably clean. But retirement has a way of exposing assumptions that looked perfectly reasonable during the accumulation years. Because receiving $2,000 every month and being able to retire safely on $2,000 every month are two very different things. Housing matters, taxes matter, healthcare matters, inflation matters, and perhaps most importantly, the quality of the portfolio producing those dividends matters. A retiree could generate the same $24,000 of annual income from a $400,000 portfolio or a $1.2 million portfolio. The income would initially look identical. The risk behind it could be completely different. And that distinction takes us to the first number we actually need to understand. Dividend income begins with an equation that is almost deceptively simple. Annual income divided by dividend yield gives us the approximate amount of invested capital required. And once we apply that equation to $24,000, the retirement picture changes quickly. At a 2% portfolio yield, generating $24,000 annually requires approximately $1.2 million. At 3%, about $800,000. At 4%, roughly $600,000. At 5%, the number falls to $480,000, and at 6%, just $400,000. That progression creates an obvious temptation. Why accumulate $800,000 when a higher-yielding portfolio might produce the same income with half as much capital? Mathematically, the argument works. Financially, it may not. Because yield is not simply an income number. It is also a price relationship. When the market begins demanding an unusually high yield from a security, sometimes investors are being offered an opportunity. Other times, they are being compensated for risk. Distinguishing between those two situations is one of the most important disciplines in dividend investing. A portfolio designed around a 6% yield, therefore, cannot automatically be considered superior to one yielding 3%. The better question is what sits underneath that yield. The portfolio gets smaller as the yield rises, but the retirement problem doesn't necessarily get easier. Consider what a dividend actually represents. It is cash leaving a business and being transferred to its owners. For that payment to remain dependable, the underlying business has to keep generating enough cash to fund operations, invest for the future, manage debt, and still return capital to shareholders. A high distribution becomes dangerous when those priorities begin competing for the same limited cash. That is why experienced income investors rarely evaluate a dividend by yield alone. They examine the durability of the business, free cash flow, balance sheet strength, payout requirements, dividend history, and management's willingness to protect the company's long-term financial health, even when that occasionally conflicts with shareholders' desire for immediate income. The consequence becomes especially important after retirement. During the accumulation years, a dividend reduction is disappointing. When those dividends are paying household expenses, the same reduction becomes a cash flow problem. Suppose a portfolio generates exactly $24,000 per year, and the retiree requires virtually all $24,000 to live. There is very little margin for error. A dividend cut, an unexpected medical expense, or a major home repair can suddenly force the investor to sell assets. That doesn't mean higher yield investments should automatically be avoided. It means the income target should never be separated from the resilience of the system producing it. And even a perfectly resilient $2,000 monthly dividend stream faces another problem that no company can completely eliminate: time. A dividend can remain perfectly intact and still lose something every year: purchasing power. Inflation does not need to destroy a retirement plan suddenly. It works more quietly than that. The Bureau of Labor Statistics describes purchasing power as the amount of goods and services a dollar can buy. When prices rise, the purchasing power of a fixed dollar amount declines. For someone living on portfolio income, that distinction is critical. Assume, purely as an illustration, that living costs rise by an average of 3% annually. A lifestyle costing $2,000 per month today would cost approximately $2,788 per month 10 years from now if that inflation rate persisted. After 20 years, it would be roughly $3,612. The retiree hasn't become more extravagant. The same lifestyle simply costs more. This is where dividend growth begins to matter more than many investors realize. A portfolio yielding 5% today, but producing little long-term income growth may solve the immediate income problem, while creating a purchasing power problem later. A lower starting yield supported by businesses capable of increasing distributions over time presents the opposite trade-off. Less income now, potentially stronger income growth later. Neither approach is universally correct. A 72-year-old retiree with substantial Social Security income, low expenses, and a paid-off home faces a very different problem from someone retiring at 50 and asking a portfolio to fund 4 or 5 decades of spending. Retirement income is therefore not simply a yield calculation, it is a time horizon calculation. And once time enters the equation, $2,000 becomes less useful as a retirement target than it initially appeared. So the target isn't really $2,000 a month, it's $2,000 of purchasing power. This reveals a distinction that often disappears in discussions about passive income. A dividend portfolio is an asset allocation strategy. Retirement is a financial system. The two overlap, but they are not identical. A retiree needs liquidity for unexpected expenses, diversification to reduce dependence on individual businesses or sectors, a tax strategy, a plan for healthcare, a strategy for Social Security, and some understanding of how spending will change over time. Focusing exclusively on dividends can create an artificial rule: never sell shares. Psychologically, that rule can feel reassuring. Income arrives, principal remains untouched, and the investor can mentally separate portfolio income from portfolio capital. But economically, retirement spending ultimately depends on total resources, not on whether every dollar happens to be labeled a dividend. This is why withdrawal research offers a useful comparison. Morningstar's latest retirement income research estimated a 3.9% starting safe withdrawal rate for a balanced portfolio under its base case assumptions. A 30-year retirement, inflation-adjusted spending, and a 90% probability of funds remaining at the end of the period. The research excludes Social Security and other non-portfolio income. That is not a universal prescription, but it gives us an interesting reference point. To generate $24,000 of first-year spending at 3.9%, the corresponding portfolio would be approximately $615,000. Notice how close that sits to the $600,000 required to generate $24,000 from a 4% yielding dividend portfolio. Yet the underlying philosophies are different. One asks, how much dividend income does the portfolio distribute? The other asks, how much total spending can the portfolio reasonably support under a defined set of assumptions? That difference matters, because retirement security is not created by preserving the number of shares in an account. It comes from matching durable financial resources with durable spending needs. And this is where the $2,000 question begins to reverse itself. Imagine two retirees. Both receive exactly $2,000 per month in dividends. For the first retiree, that is essentially the entire household income. For the second, the same dividends sit beside Social Security, perhaps a pension, substantial cash reserves, and a mortgage-free home. Same dividend income, completely different retirement. The first portfolio carries enormous responsibility. Almost every unexpected expense becomes a portfolio problem. The second portfolio is only one layer of a broader income structure. Social Security can be particularly important here because retirement portfolio research typically becomes more flexible when guaranteed income covers a larger portion of essential spending. Morningstar specifically notes the buffering effect that Social Security can have when retirees use more flexible withdrawal approaches. This changes how we should think about the original question. Can someone retire on $2,000 per month in dividends? Yes, under certain circumstances. Someone with very low fixed expenses, limited debt, adequate healthcare coverage, additional reliable income, and meaningful financial reserves could potentially find $24,000 of annual dividend income, more than sufficient to close the gap between guaranteed income and spending. For another household, $2,000 may barely cover housing and healthcare. The dividend number alone tells us almost nothing. The real retirement target isn't income. It's the gap between income and expenses, and a gap that reaches exactly zero is not necessarily a successful retirement plan. Suppose essential and discretionary spending totals exactly $2,000 per month. The portfolio also generates exactly $2,000. On paper, the plan balances perfectly. That perfection is precisely the weakness. Real life does not arrive in smooth monthly averages. A roof needs replacing. Insurance premiums change. Healthcare costs appear. A company cuts its dividend. Markets decline. Inflation arrives faster than expected. The purpose of a margin of safety is not to predict which of these events will happen. It is to avoid requiring the prediction. A retiree whose essential spending consumes every dollar of portfolio income has less flexibility than someone whose income comfortably exceeds core expenses, or who maintains separate reserves for irregular costs. This principle becomes even more important for an investor determined never to sell shares. The more restrictions placed on the retirement strategy, the greater the amount of resilience required elsewhere. That resilience might come from higher guaranteed income, lower expenses, larger cash reserves, a more diversified portfolio, or simply more invested capital. There is no universal combination. There is only the relationship between them. And that relationship reveals why chasing a specific monthly dividend target can sometimes cause investors to optimize the wrong variable. So return to the original number, $2,000 per month. At a 4% portfolio yield, producing that income requires approximately $600,000. At 3%, roughly $800,000. At 5%, approximately $480,000. Those numbers are useful, but none of them tells you whether retirement is affordable. That answer begins somewhere else. How much does your life actually cost? Which expenses are essential? Which expenses can change during difficult markets? How much income will arrive from outside the portfolio? How much liquidity exists for emergencies? How diversified are the businesses producing your dividends? And crucially, can that income grow fast enough to protect purchasing power over a retirement that may last decades? Once those questions have been answered, the $2,000 target finally gains meaning. For one investor, it may represent more income than the portfolio ever needs to produce. For another, it may reveal that retirement remains financially fragile despite reaching a long-awaited dividend milestone. That is why the most important transition in retirement investing is not from salary to dividends. It is from accumulation to planning. During accumulation, the investor asks how large the portfolio can become. Retirement demands a more difficult question. How much responsibility can this portfolio safely carry? Retirement is not achieved when dividends reach a particular number. It becomes viable when the entire system can survive what the number cannot predict. There is something appealing about living entirely from dividends. The strategy creates discipline. It encourages investors to think about cash flow, business quality, and long-term ownership rather than constantly reacting to market prices. Those are valuable habits. Yet the deepest lesson is not that $2,000 per month is enough, or that it isn't. It is that retirement cannot be reduced to a dividend target. The investor with the strongest retirement plan is not necessarily the one generating the highest yield, nor is it automatically the person with the largest portfolio. It is the investor whose spending, reliable income, liquidity, portfolio construction, and margin of safety work together. Dividends can play an important role inside that structure. Dividend growth can help defend purchasing power. Quality businesses can provide durable cash generation. Diversification can reduce dependence on any single company. And additional sources of reliable income can reduce the burden placed on the portfolio. But no single one of those elements creates retirement security by itself. So perhaps the better question is not, can I retire on $2,000 a month in dividends? It is, if those dividends were tested by inflation, a bear market, unexpected expenses, and decades of retirement, would the rest of my financial plan still work? Once an investor can answer that question with confidence, the monthly dividend number finally becomes what it should have been all along, not the retirement plan, one part of it. This content is provided for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered financial, investment, tax, or legal advice. Dividend payments are not guaranteed and may be reduced or eliminated. Investment values can fluctuate, and every investor's financial circumstances, objectives, tax situation, risk tolerance, and retirement needs are different. Consider consulting a qualified financial professional before making investment or retirement planning decisions.